This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
Somewhere between 25 and 40% of the CRM degrades annually. Even if you're following best practices, that's just going to happen. That's the natural churn of things.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Chris LoPresti, partner at Touchpoints, a data solutions company serving the nonprofit industry. Hello, Chris. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Hi, Jen. Thanks so much for having me.
Before we jump into the topic of data, which is vast and exciting, I'm wondering if you're willing to share with us a little bit about what prompted you and your brother to start your company, Touchpoints.
I love telling this story. So it was not intentional, but I think that's how most good companies start. So prior to founding Touchpoints, I worked in New York for a prominent venture capitalist. And one of the things you quickly learn on the job in the venture investing business is that most successful businesses are the ones that solve real problems. So I've always been someone who's taking notes and looking for patterns when people mention that they have a problem or something they'd be willing to pay to solve. So that being said, I've also been very involved with the Boy Scouts of America throughout my life. I'm a proud Eagle Scout. And when I was in college, actually, I was doing some volunteer work for the Scouts at the national level. And I learned what a challenge it was for them as an organization to stay connected with their donors, alumni, volunteers, because people are constantly moving, people pass away, et cetera, et cetera. And, depending on whose stat you use, somewhere between 25 and 40% of the data in a CRM degrades each year. So a big problem for everyone, nonprofits and for-profits. And, for the Scouts, they hope that their supporters would inform them anytime they change their contact information. But in reality, we're all very busy people and we'll likely forget. And so that data degrades over time. And so seeing this challenge at such a large nonprofit like the Scouts, what a challenge it was staying connected with their constituents, led us on a path to building a suite of solutions to help organizations stay better connected and better understand their supporters. And now, having done this for several years and helped hundreds of organizations with their data, we know that this problem is prevalent across organizations of all types and sizes.
Okay, so you saw there was a problem. You started out investing in or working for someone who's investing in other companies, and then you decided to start a company. I think that's truly courageous. Congratulations. That's huge.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really fun and rewarding ride so far. I'm a problem solver. That's the type of person I am, and it's been a joy, especially to help so many nonprofits solve their data problems, which really make a big impact for the organization and their overall mission.
Yeah, whenever someone's in venture capital or private equity, something like that, and they've never run their own company, I'm always questioning that because they're just very different sides or viewpoints. So I'm really impressed. And I couldn't agree with you more. The organizations I work with as a consultant, when I work with people who are prospect researchers, they have to work in the CRM, the database, the donor database, and everybody struggles with their data. And for many organizations, it really is a disaster. The vice president or the new director of development comes on board, they want to do a mailing, and only to discover that no one has mailed to that database of records for years. So, people have moved or died. It's awful. It really sets back what they're able to do. And we know how important their missions are. And it does often happen when somebody new comes on board, because otherwise everybody's happy with the status quo. I'm wondering if you have advice for a new leader when they come on board to make sure not just that the data gets fixed, but that nothing bad happens again.
Yes. Well, I wish everyone came into a new role with that mindset. I think that would make their life easier and certainly our life easier. I think most organizations don't understand that their databases are a disaster or are filled with problems. So knowing that it's a problem and wanting to fix it are truly half the battle. Like many things in life, most people assume that they're better than the average, but in reality, more of their data are inaccurate and outdated than they guess or want to believe. And I think a big part of the problem is the disconnect between the person who interacts with the database and the person who executes using that data, because there's that missing closed feedback loop. For example, if your organization sends direct mail to supporters, you assume that any mail that doesn't get returned to sender is received by the intended recipient, because otherwise, how would you know? So unless you're getting a pile of or bag of mail returned to your organization, you don't really acknowledge or feel the problem. Meanwhile, a large percentage of the mail is going right in the trash because that person no longer lives there or is deceased. I personally analyze my mail probably closer than almost anyone else because I'm always looking for who sends outdated mail. I think it's really interesting, but also it's very appropriate for our business. And I constantly see mail sent to people who haven't lived at my address in 10 plus years. My parents have lived in their same home for 25 plus years, and they still occasionally get mail for the previous owners, which is just wild. And these are from really large corporations and organizations who you'd think would be really diligent about their data best practices and policies. So thank you for putting up with my passionate digression. I think your original question was, what's my advice for new fundraising leader, how to prevent it and fix it? Is that correct?
Yes. They don't want it to happen again. They know they have to clean it up now, but how can they make sure that it doesn't get dirty again?
Okay, so if you're new to a role, making cleaning up the data is definitely one of the first things you should do. It's an upfront investment, but the ROI will be outstanding, and the success of any of your future fundraising strategy depends on good data. It's the bedrock, it's the foundation, and it's much more effective to retain and expand existing donors than to acquire a new one. So, I'd recommend you research and partner with a consumer data company that can update and enrich your records. This might seem like a big ordeal, but it's something that can be done quickly and with minimal time from your team. I know that's always, besides the financial resources, just the time resources is always a concern, but it's something that can be done at scale and quickly. I'd also advise that not all data are created equally. So, do your homework, definitely get what you pay for in this industry. There's a reason that some data is very inexpensive, cheap, one might say. But for preventing the bad data, I think it's twofold. So one, you need to set up some internal rules for how the data is going to be edited. Who's allowed to access it? How are you allowed to change things? How do you note when you're changing things? Because we see a ton of problems with clients with their data standardization. They just have poor best practices. So setting up that strategy to begin with, and then getting everyone on board who has access to the data to follow that is going to be a big step for preventing that from happening again. And then the other thing is that you need to schedule regular updates and enrichment. So I said earlier, somewhere between 25 and 40% of a CRM degrades annually. Even if you're following best practices, that's just going to happen. That's the natural churn of things. And so you need to set up a schedule for how frequently as an organization do we want to make sure we have current addresses? How frequently as an organization do we want to update phone numbers, emails, people's occupation, make sure people haven't passed away? But I think setting up those two things will make you, in the top 10% of organizations in terms of best data practices.
I think that's great advice. And I just want to give you a scenario and maybe you can give advice on it. So oftentimes when I'm going to be hired as a prospect researcher, they want to do a wealth screening as a way of prioritizing donors, and it works really well. So I ask them I try to sort of assess really quickly, like how bad is the data going to be? And I'll ask them about their mailings, and do they mail to their file, and do they get address updates? And many times they'll say, well, yeah, it's part of the mail house. So when they do their direct appeals, the mail house runs for change of address, et cetera. But what I've discovered is I have to ask them another question. Does that actually get back into the database? So I think some people are fooled by that. Oh, I sent my file out, we mailed to them, but maybe there's no communication backwards. So sure, they didn't mail to people who are dead or changed address, but they also didn't update their actual donor database. When you are talking to fundraisers, like what do you point them to? How do you sort of get around that without, grilling them on their practices? How do you let them know what good data practice is?
Great question. So we always try to be education focused. So I think the more information someone has, the better the decision they're going to make. So one, I love that you're asking people if they've updated their database before you do something like a wealth screening, because the success of the wealth screening relies on, again, that bedrock of the foundation of data that you put into that process or system. So making sure that's clean is really crucial. And then I think you're also 100% correct that most organizations don't reincorporate the updates that their mail house may be able to provide from something like an NCOA or some type of disease screening. So making sure there is that closed feedback loop is really critical. The other thing I would say related to NCOA is, as a process, the National Change of Address Service relies on Americans submitting a postcard, an e-postcard or a physical postcard, letting the post office know that they moved, and less than 50% of Americans do that. So that's not even a perfect solution. So, things fall through the cracks. That compounds over time and the data gets worse and worse. And so we strongly recommend that organizations do an audit. There are a lot of data companies that will do this for free. They'll offer a complimentary data health check, which will allow them to figure out how bad is my data today without actually having to update their information or incur any cost. And I think most organizations that are interested in having good data or interested in being effective with their fundraising are open to anything that's free. It's in the nonprofit space. Free is gold, right? So we just try to get organizations to be aware that data does degrade, even if they're doing a perfect job, and then try to get them to do some type of analysis so that they're more informed and then can inform their colleagues about the current state of affairs.
Okay. So their nonprofit leaders are used to the wealth screening companies who have trained them to submit a file and get sort of that free result look. So what you're saying is they could do the same thing with the health of their data, and they could come to a company like yours and they could get that health check that doesn't fix the problem for them, but at least lets them know what it's like. They could budget for it. They could budget for better practices too. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And at Touchpoints, we offer a complimentary data health check where you send us your house file, and then we will return an analysis to you. And it will include things like the percent of records that are deceased, et cetera. And this really gives you a great understanding of how is your data today in this moment, how much is outdated, how good is it? And then that can inform the internal conversations, as you mentioned, related to budget, strategy, timeline, et cetera.
We've been talking about the data that's in there. They get new donors, they have events, et cetera. So they've been collecting data. Another thing that trips up nonprofit fundraisers and just nonprofits, anyone who collects data, is it keeps changing what we should be collecting, right? So I remember when email became big and then everyone had to start collecting it. And that was a big change and we weren't prepared for that. The same kinds of things are happening now where we have cell phone numbers and we need to differentiate. We now have more international people giving to our causes, and big or small. So there's changing needs in what we should be collecting in our data. Do you have any suggestions for how nonprofit leaders, especially fundraising leaders, could get ahead of that data collection game or at least plan for it?
This is a tough one. It's something we get asked about all the time, and I don't think there's a perfect answer. We all want to be collecting as much information as possible. It helps us better understand that individual, but also allows us to connect with them across multiple forms of communication. But on the other hand, of course, we all know that if you ask someone to fill out a form that has 20 different fields, the likelihood of conversion is going to decline dramatically. And so you're trying to get the most effective minimum fields of collection. So, email is king, but the problem is email, like many of the other data points, degrades at a pretty high rate. So people change email addresses way more often than you would expect. And in particular, if people sign up with a business email, that number degrades at an even higher rate. So we usually recommend to clients that they at least collect name, postal address, and email at a minimum. And that allows them the highest likelihood of being able to stay connected with this individual, even if they change their email address. You'll be able to use some third-party service or send them direct mail or something to get them back into the funnel to identify the best way to communicate with them. It really is a tough one, but the good news is that once you at least have name and address, you can enrich those records with other information like phone or occupation or age or net worth, et cetera.
What about social media accounts? I've looked at it in the past, and I know that researchers struggle with there's not a clear match. There's not a clear and easy way to know that the username is associated with a particular donor name. Do you have any insight on how that's going in the data field, making those matches?
Yes, there are some companies and solutions out there that are able to identify social media profiles connected to a donor profile. Our company Touchpoints offers one of those solutions where you could send us something like the name and postal address of a donor, and we're actually able to locate the LinkedIn URL or the Twitter handle of a donor. It is possible, but the linkage is trickier, and as a result, the match rates are lower. Of course, you're also dealing with privacy settings. So all these companies like ours are only able to deal with publicly available information. And so there's a balance. It's not something like if you were to go to a vendor and do a network screening or a birthday or age append where the coverage would be 90% plus. With social media, there tends to be a drop off. So it's more like 10 to 50%.
Got it. Well, before I let you go, I'm wondering if you have any tips for fundraising professionals, including researchers, on how they might use their data more creatively for fundraising. Maybe something you've seen with clients or ideas that you have.
Well, this is actually one of my favorite parts of my job is getting to hear how organizations are using our data. We try to check in with clients quarterly or at least twice a year to say, how did the results go? What have you been doing with it? What's working? What's not working? And then we try to create some content and help share that information with other organizations. And one of the things that I have been really excited to see is how organizations are using occupation information. So this would be, the job title and the employer. There's lots of different use cases, and I can go through some of them. But one that is more obvious in the nonprofit space is the employer matching gift program, where some corporations will match any employee's contribution to certain types of nonprofits. And this is one of those things that has a really incredible ROI. I know there's some large corporations. One that comes to mind is Kraft Foods. They match employee donations, I think 5-1. So that's a lot of free, low-hanging money that organizations can capture if they actually knew which company their donors work for. So that's one thing that you can do if you're able to identify the employment information for a donor. We've also heard some really creative use cases for other divisions of the fundraising team. So for major gifts, using recent promotions to identify if you should be asking for more money or cultivating someone to give more money because they keep, receiving promotions and are now in the C-suite or they're now a senior vice president at a large company. And you can use that as a proxy to figure out maybe salary or total compensation. Relatedly, we see occupation information being used by plan giving professionals, just more insights into a person's life. How old are they? What type of career have they had? Have they changed careers? Is this something that you could even just form a bond or relationship over common interests related to their professional career? And then the last one, because I could talk about this for hours, is related to corporate partnerships. And I think this is another underutilized application of knowing the occupation information of your donors. I've heard from organizations that they found out that a donor worked for a large technology company, and then that technology company donated in kind hardware, so like computers, to the organization. And just because they knew that this person worked at this large company, they were able to ask and say, hey, do you have any type of program? We need new computers. Is this something you could help us with? And they were able to deliver on that, which is worth a whole lot more than I think what this individual was just giving as an individual donor to the organization. I've seen the data from a corporate partnership perspective being used for CSR. So if you knew that someone who's donated to your organization is actually the head of CSR for a company, that could open up some really interesting doors as ways to partner as a nonprofit. And then the very last thing related to corporate partnerships is if you did a big analysis on everyone who's a donor to your organization and you found that there were some concentrations of donors who all worked at the same company, it's a really effective argument to then go to that company and say, hey, 2,000 of your employees have donated to our organization over the years. Why don't we form some formal type of partnership where people make a donation every Friday, they can wear jeans to work. I know that some banks do this, and then they pick a large nonprofit like the United Way as beneficiary of those funds. And so if you're better able to understand who your donors are, where they work, the types of roles that they're in, you're able to pull out some insights that can lead to some really large, exciting partnership, plan giving, major gift opportunities.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's great tips just from occupation. So many opportunities. And I think it is very overlooked. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jen. This was a blast. I appreciate it.
That was Chris LoPresti, partner at Touchpoints, a data solutions company serving the nonprofit industry, sharing how you can clean up your donor data and coax it into doing some of the heavy lifting in support of your fundraising strategies. You can find Chris at findtouchpoints.com.